And this is something that happened when my wife and I were visiting a friend of ours. They have a son, he was about 4 years old. And you're right, you discover that basically everything that preschoolers do you find yourself and your own experience in their lives and experience. So we were visiting these friends, and they have a son, and he was playing in the living room, and then he went off into his parents' bedroom, and he came back and he was wearing a necklace and a bracelet. And he said to us, "Who am I? What am I?" And we weren't sure what to guess. We said, "Are you your mother?" He said, "No." We said, "Are you a teacher?" He said, "No." And he got increasingly frustrated. And finally, he blurted out, "I'm a rabbi." And in a way, we should have understood, or could have understood, because my wife is a rabbi, and that's how she was dressed. And, at the time, I was already deep at work on my novel, Joy Comes in the Morning, which has at the heart of it a woman rabbi. But it was a reminder for me, a kind of confirmation of just how fascinating and unexpected and new aspects of modern Jewish life can be. And women rabbis seemed to me then, as they do now, pretty good exemplars of that braid of the modern, the new, the contemporary, and the traditional. Deborah, the rabbi in my novel, at one point she says to her boyfriend Lev that rabbis are like strippers. They exhibit something in public that most people only reveal in private. And that's a religious self, or a spiritual self. I think this has always been true for rabbis, at least rabbis in a modern secular society, maybe American rabbis. But obviously that comment has added resonance in a world where there are women rabbis. And I chose Deborah's words about strippers carefully because I wanted, and Deborah wants, to introduce an unexpected sexual note. Because rabbis have bodies as well as souls, and writing about a woman rabbi allowed me to explore this even more, although it is, of course, the challenge facing all of us. How do we integrate all the parts of ourselves? And this is one of the things that novels, to my mind, are very good at exploring. D.H. Lawrence, a writer I admire a great deal, spoke of what he called the presentation self, that artificial self that you construct to meet the world. And he felt the job of the writer was partly to reveal what was hidden behind that presentation self. It's one of the reasons people find the imagination threatening. For Lawrence, in writing when he did, it was often the sexual self that was hidden, that welled up and overwhelmed us, our animal nature. I think now we're more attuned, at least in literature, to that sexual self. I think it's often the religious self that's hidden, that's the buried self, and that's one of the things that stories can help get at. My wife, as I mentioned, is a rabbi. She's not Deborah, the rabbi in my novel. No one believes me, but it's true. My book came out like a year ago in the fall, and so I've had a year of disclaimers. My first novel, Eve's Apple, was about a woman with an eating disorder, a woman who's starving herself, and a man who's obsessed with her illness and who's determined to unravel the mystery of her suffering. And for years afterwards, when we were out to dinner, I could see people eyeing my wife's plate to see if she was the model, and she really wasn't. I would always explain, if they asked, that she keeps kosher, but that's not the same as an eating disorder, at least I don't think so. But, but I would be lying if I told you that being married to a rabbi didn't have a huge effect on me and on my novel and on my life. Certainly it opened a window on a world that would have been hidden to me otherwise, and it's given me a sense, I think, of what it means for women to assume the mantle of religious leadership, although that is not at all the only thing my novel is about. I met my wife before she even applied to rabbinical school, so I never had the experience that's part of the central romance in the book, which is the experience of dating a rabbi, which I have no doubt can be a kind of scary prospect for a man. What strange gender anxiety, religious anxiety, social anxiety, sexual anxiety, spiritual anxiety that might give rise to, I could only imagine and guess, but that was part of the fun of writing the novel. For their first date, Lev, who is a science reporter and a religious skeptic, and Deborah, the rabbi, are supposed to go to a Yankees game. But at the last minute, a friend of Deborah's, who's a rabbi, gets sick, and she's asked to fill in for him and perform a funeral. And so their first date actually begins at Riverside Memorial Chapel in Manhattan, and then it moves to a cemetery in Queens, and only eventually makes its way to Yankee Stadium. They get there just in time for the seventh inning stretch. And to Lev, whose head is spinning from his weird and unexpected mourning, the infield dirt somehow reminds him of the earth that he's just helped shovel on the grave. And the bright outfield grass somehow looks like the field that he's seen planted with graves, with those bodies buried under Bernie Williams' feet. The world is starting to look different to him, and it's only their first date. Deborah is attractive. She thinks about her body. At one point before Lev comes over to her apartment, she changes T-shirts because she decides that Target breast cancer is sexier than 7 Ways to Love Israel, which is the T-shirt that she has on. She's beautiful. Lev keeps wondering about the body under the robe. She's a Reform rabbi. She wears a black robe, and when he sees her officiating at the funeral, that's what she's wearing. And in a way, a novel is worthless if it's merely an allegory or emblematic, but I can't help thinking that that's not unlike the relationship a lot of Jews, American Jews, have to Judaism, which is a relationship of attraction and fear. Lev is fascinated by that robe, but he's also afraid that it will smother him, that it will eclipse his spontaneous self, his American self, his sexual self, his liberated self. And I think I myself understand it as a writer there's a tremendous anxiety among writers who are Jewish, whether or not they are Jewish writers. And I think that's partly because the ethos in this country is to make it new, as Ezra Pound said, make it new. But tradition is the opposite of that. Tradition is already written and speaks for you, or can. And that sense that if you are an American writer who is also a Jewish writer, tethering yourself to tradition, will you lose what is American about yourself? Will you not participate in that free, liberated, adventurous self? It's a tension. It's an unresolved thing. But Deborah herself, the rabbi, worries about this. The T-shirt joke is a joke, but she's aware of the irony, and it has a serious overtone. What does it mean that cancer is sexier than Israel? How depressing is that, she thinks. In any event, Deborah is for Lev a fascinating and sometimes frightening blend of the old and the new. And I've tried with all my characters to bring together opposing worlds, because we all live in so many worlds at once. Not just Jews, although Jews certainly do often live in multiple worlds, but everybody contains contradictory elements that need to be resolved in life. And I sometimes think of novels as books, even if they're nonfiction, as houses, which if they're built right, they can hold contradictions, and they can sort of house impulses that seem opposed. My last book was a nonfiction book. It was called The Talmud and the Internet. And it was an attempt, the subtitle is A Journey Between Worlds, and I wanted the Talmud in that title to evoke the ancient, traditional, religious world of impulses, and the internet to conjure a sense of the modern, technological, secular world. And how is it possible to live between those worlds? In what ways do they mirror each other? In which ways are they antithetical? That book also had a very personal element. It began with the death of my American-born grandmother, who lived a long and prosperous and lucky American life and was almost 95 when she died. And it ends anticipating the birth of my daughter. And so it moves in some sense from the world of death to the world of life. But I also write about my other grandmother, my father's mother, who was murdered in the Holocaust and who was always just a ghost to me and who I never knew. And how those two grandmothers often seemed like matter and antimatter. They couldn't occupy the same space because they represented such different worlds. The world of loss and destruction and sorrow, and the world of American prosperity. But I am the grandchild of both of them, and so in a sense I am the inheritor of both of those worlds. And writing that book was an attempt to house those seemingly contradictory elements and put them side by side, almost like a point and a counterpoint in a Talmudic formulation.